Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 episodes of Star Trek Voyager. In this video, I count down my top 10 favorite episodes as well as my 5 least favorite episodes of Star Trek Voyager. This video is a revamp, a remake, a replacement of a video I did 3 years ago that I feel is a bit outdated in terms of quality, and I changed my mind slightly on what should be in this top 10, so I thought it was about time for an update. However, the original video will be deleted as this is now my official word on what my favorite and least favorite episodes of Voyager are. So, as always, before I get into my favorite episodes of Star Trek Voyager, let me start by naming my 5 least favorite episodes of Voyager. Now, I've gotten a few comments over the years claiming that I hate Voyager because I had such strong negative things to say about some of the episodes, which is totally and completely not the case. I love Star Trek Voyager. I ultimately gave the show a 9 out of 10, and I consider it one of my favorite all-time shows. But that doesn't mean that every episode is pure gold or that it always gets it right. So this is my list that is just for me to count down what is, in my opinion, the 5 worst examples of Voyager where they didn't get it right. So we'll start with my number 5 worst episode, Tuvix. Now, this is an episode that a lot of people consider their favorite, so I've gotten a lot of backlash throughout the years for picking this as one of the worst, but I firmly stand by my pick and still contend that this is one of the worst episodes of Voyager, and for more detail on that, you can check out my full review on the episode. Suffice to say here, I felt this episode totally fumbled the idea of having Tuvok and Neelix merge. The original idea for this episode was a comedy in which I think it would have been much better idea. As it is, it comes off as a cheesy, over-the-top melodrama, as my personal issue with it is that I had a problem with Jane. It's not that I had a problem with Janeway's decision, but more of I thought this episode did a terrible job at presenting this moral dilemma that to me is confused by the fact that at some point the show treats Tuvix not as a separate individual but as another version of both Tuvok and Neelix, but then the episode ultimately ends treating the separation of Tuvix as a murder to point of Tuvix going around screaming, "I want to live," which to me is one of the most cheesiest scenes ever that I ever seen, because to me Tuvix isn't a separate individual. He's just another version of Neelix and Tuvok, and this episode itself had many indications to prove this. So them separating isn't killing an individual any more than Tuvok when he lost his memories in the episode Riddles and was acting like a totally different person, and they regave him his memories, so he went back to being a different person. Is more comparable to that than murdering someone. So this whole scene came off as melodrama cheese to me. The Enterprise episode Similitude, they actually executed this moral dilemma properly and in a thought-provoking way. Here, in my opinion, they completely and totally botched it. It's one of the biggest messes of an episode in the entire Star Trek franchise. Next, we'll move on to my number 4, Spirit Folk. This is one of the most useless and ridiculous episodes of Voyager. This is a sequel to the episode Fairhaven, where Voyager crew hangs out in the holodeck program at an Irish pub, and Janeway falls in love with the hologram, which was also not a good episode at all. But this episode takes it even further by bringing back this boring storyline for a plot that's so over-the-top ridiculous and had several easy solutions that the episode had to ignore to make poor excuses in order to keep this paper-thin plot going. It wasn't at all funny, it was just dumb and embarrassingly bad. Coming in at number 3 is Threshold. This episode is renowned amongst Voyager fans as being one of the worst Star Trek episodes. Brennan Braga, who wrote the episode, has even acknowledged this episode didn't quite work. I don't personally find it to be the worst Voyager episode, but it is quite bad, as the whole premise hinges on a piece of Star Trek lore that if you hit Warp 10 barrier, you exist in every point in the universe at once, and that is inconsistent with several mentions throughout the Star Trek franchise where ships have been stated to go beyond speeds of Warp 10. 10. But beyond that, this episode is mostly a poorly written romp where Paris transforms into a weird being that is meant to come off as Cronenberg-esque, but instead it comes off as comically bad. But of course, what everyone remembers most about this episode is its horrid ending where Paris and Janeway evolve into lizard creatures and have lizard babies together. Yeah. So by far, one of the worst endings of any episode. Next, on to my number 2 worst Voyager episode, and that is The Fight. It's amazing how horrible and poorly executed this episode was, as it has a plot of Chakotay trying to communicate with some aliens from another dimension or whatever, but it's about boxing. I mean, what? What in the hell does boxing have to do with aliens from another dimension? Anyway, as apparently Chakotay communicates with them through boxing. Star Trek has a history of coming up with poor, contrived excuses to hamstring a theme into an episode, such as the plot of Bride of Chaotica with the photonic aliens was just an excuse to do a 40s-style schlock sci-fi themed show, or how the plot of Spectre of the Gun with the aliens who punish Kirk for violating their space was just an excuse to do a wide Earp Western themed episode. But this episode is by far the worst example. I mean, the scene where Chakotay is boxing and the aliens communicating through a strung together edit of other people talking was laughably bad. In fact, I do think I recall laughing my ass off at how horrible this scene was when I first saw it. And I'm typically not one to laugh at things that are so bad. So making this just a poorly executed clusterfuck of an episode. And my number 1 worst episode of Star Trek Voyager is Endgame. Now, if you're finding my channel for the first time, this pick may have surprised you, as many consider this one the best episodes of Voyager, but those who are familiar with my channel are probably sick of hearing me rant about this episode. I trashed it so much I even recently made a compilation of all the times I trashed this episode. So because I'll just be repeating myself and I don't want to babble on forever, let me just go through some of the bullet points. This was a horrible way to end the series because it didn't stay true to the theme of that the show set. It zapped all of the fun of them returning home, which we'd been waiting 7 years to see. It defied the precedent set just earlier that same season that changing the timeline to get Voyager home was a bad idea. It had a ridiculous romance with Chakotay and 7 and 9, which was literally the dumbest romance Star Trek has ever done, as it had no chemistry whatsoever. This episode acted like Barclay is the main character of Voyager, which he most certainly is not. And to top it all off, they made the Borg into a silly, cartoonish Jar Jar Binks level villain who says Janeway every time they see her, just like a Scooby-Doo villain would. And then they established this intergalactic hub where the Borg can send any number of ships to anywhere in the galaxy, including right in front of Earth, anytime they want, which begs the question why they haven't already sent a giant fleet to assimilate Earth instead of trying these convoluted, ridiculous plots with counterparts or time travel or retroviruses. So in short, nothing about this episode works. It's just a travesty, and in response to the many people who say, well, I bet you couldn't think of a better way to end the series, there are a pair of novels, Homecoming and The Furthest Shore, that prove this wrong because they are by far superior way to end the series. It's a sad state of affairs when adapting novels are far better at telling Star Trek stories than the actual Star Trek writers, making this, in my opinion, the very worst episode of Star Trek Voyager. Okay, so that is enough of the negativity. Let me now get into my favorite episodes of Star Trek Voyager, but before I get to my top 10, let me start with a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10, starting with my first honorable mention, Memorial, a very powerful episode that drives home the importance of remembering important events so they never happen again. And the lengths Janeway goes to ensure this happens is controversial, but overall very powerful and poignant. Next honorable mention is Nemesis. This was an extremely powerful episode that warns of the dangers of propaganda. As you follow Chakotay, as it appears he's helping defend innocent bystanders against brutal aggressors, only to find out that he's been brainwashed for the purpose of a war machine, and nothing is as it appears to be. This not only is great in terms of shocking storytelling, but a great way to deliver a relevant message that speaks to our society. Another honorable mention is Remember, another episode with a powerful social commentary on society. This one tackles racism and the importance of remembering history, as B'Elanna experiences the memory of a woman whose race participated in a genocide fed by racial hatred, one in which that has been covered up by history, in this important, powerful quest to uncover the truth, and for those who think they know history for certain to be more open-minded. Next honorable mention is A Living Witness, another episode that brilliantly explores the importance of remembering history. This one, though, takes huge risks by having the entire episode set 700 years in the future that visits an alien race whom Voyager had impacted all those centuries ago, and how they misremembered history. And the Doctor shows up to set the record straight and has doubts when race riots break out because of the revelations that he uncovers. But together with the historian, they realize the importance of getting history right, and they ultimately strive for peace. And my final honorable mention is The Void, a great episode of Voyager where it's stuck in a lifeless void and must form a coalition with other aliens by forming their own sort of mini federation in order to pool their resources, not only to survive the void but to ultimately escape. This was a great, exciting episode that put Janeway's morals to the test, but she ultimately survives by doing things the Starfleet way, proving negotiation and cooperation is the best solution to the galaxy's problems. The whole episode was true to the principles of Star Trek and exciting storytelling as well. So now let me get into my top 10 favorite episodes of Star Trek Voyager, starting with my number 10, Eye of the Needle. This was a nice, quiet episode that shows how great of a character story Voyager could have been. It's a bit sad that in later seasons the studio interference led to the show forcing battle and fight sequences every single episode, but this episode is a nice breath of fresh air showing what the show could have been, because I love how there's no action, no outrageous conflict, and yet this episode manages to be more engaging than most, as it explores the crew's feelings of being so far from home and how this affected them, and seeing Janeway reach out and form a connection with a scientist from an adversarial race whom the Federation typically see as the enemy was amazingly well done. But to top it all off, it ends with a fascinating sci-fi note where we learn the wormhole doesn't just go through space but also through time, as the Romulan they've been talking to is from 26 years in the past. In my opinion, this episode encompasses a lot of what makes Star Trek great. Getting now to my number 9, which is Workforce. This fascinating two-parter that was very effective, suspenseful thrill ride begins with Janeway and crew living out new and different lives as workers on a Delta Quadrant planet where they have no memories of their past lives. This episode was structured perfectly as we're thrown into seeing the crew with their new lives and slowly learn what really happened, and that is part of a conspiracy where that attacks alien ships to steal their crews and erase their memories and plant them on their planet as factory workers. And the side plot with Chakotay, Kim, and the Doctor struggling to maintain Voyager on a skeleton crew was equally as impressive, and Janeway's personal character story in these episodes were handled really well, as she meets a man, falls in love, but then Chakotay comes and tries to make her realize that her whole life is a lie and that her real life was stolen from her. And the personal struggle that she goes through as she has to choose between her new life and the old one was handled beautifully, making this two-parter a very powerful one. Next, we'll get to my number 8, which is timeless. This was a very powerful episode that shows an alternate future where Chakotay and Harry Kim make it back to the Alpha Quadrant in the shuttle, but Voyager is destroyed in the process. So it shows Chakotay and a very regret-ridden Harry Kim in the future struggling to change the past so that Voyager never got destroyed. And at the same time, we see flashbacks of Voyager's attempt to get home using the slipstream drive and learn how it failed in the first place. And the way this was executed was amazingly dark as we start to get a sense of the huge weight of regret that the future Harry Kim feels as he blames himself for Voyager's destruction, which makes his redemption all the more powerful in the scene where present-day Kim was watching the message from the future Harry Kim where he says, "You owe me one," was a truly heartwarming scene. And in my humble little opinion, had Voyager actually made it back to the Alpha Quadrant in this episode, it would have made a far, 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 far superior finale to Endgame, but that's just me. Coming in at number 7 is Resistance. This is a truly heart-wrenching episode that is one of the most emotionally powerful and effective storytellings in the Star Trek universe, in my opinion. One that is incredibly underrated and doesn't get nearly as much recognition as it deserves. Resistance tells the very tense story of an away team getting trapped on a hostile alien planet whose authoritarian government goes after the Voyager crew for working with the rebels to gain much needed supplies. While B'Elanna and Tuvok are captured and tortured, Janeway must get help from an insane old man who mistakes her for his daughter. At first he just comes off as this crazy old man, but the more you learn about him, the more you sympathize with him as you learn both his daughter and wife were killed in an incident many believe was his fault, which led to his current state of denial. And when Janeway told him she was his daughter and that she forgives him while he died, was one of the most effective tear-jerking scenes in the entire series. So overall, a very memorable and effective episode. Next is my number 6, Jetrel. This was a very emotionally charged, dialogue-based bottle episode modeled after the successful Deep Space Nine episode Duet, which also just so happens to be my all-time favorite Star Trek episode. Jetrel isn't quite as effective as Duet, but still a worthy successor and unique episode in its own right. Jetrel features some amazing acting and with some powerful universal messages of regret and forgiveness, as it makes a powerful analogy of the consequences of the effects of weapons of mass destruction, and deals with one of the scientists' quest for forgiveness after creating such a destructive weapon. However, what really makes this episode effective is the personal journey Neelix goes through in order to find it in his heart to forgive Jetrel, and as he has to confront his own personal demons and realize that part of his hatred of Jetrel was just a deflection of his own shame and feelings of guilt. And the way this all played out was masterfully done, resulting in an extremely powerful and emotionally resonant ending. Moving on to my number 5, Scorpion. This classic two-parter that ends Season 3 and starts the great Season 4 was effective not only because it used the Borg in an amazing way to create an overwhelming sense of foreboding, but also for the personal stories it managed to tell along the way. The idea at the core of the episode of Voyager coming across an alien threat even worse than the Borg, to the point where their best option was to form an alliance with the Borg, was an amazing idea that really ups the stake for the Borg storyline and elevated my opinion. Mind you, this was before Voyager ruined the Borg, which began in the 5th season episode Dark Frontier, which was considered for my worst list but didn't quite make it. However, before this happened, Voyager actually improved upon the Borg storyline, particularly with this episode, and on top of that you got some great character stories, the most important of which was Janeway and Chakotay being totally split on how to deal with the situation and the struggle they go through until they realize the best way to proceed is to work together despite any differences that they had. And the way this was executed made for what is, in my opinion, the best Captain First Officer story ever done in Star Trek, making this 2-parter quite a powerful and memorable one indeed. So, next let's get to my number 4, which is Blink of an Eye, which was a very unique episode in Star Trek lore, as for the most part it tells the story from the perspective of the inhabitants of a planet where time moves at a much faster rate than the rest of the galaxy, and thus we get to see this planet evolve from a primitive caveman state to a warp-capable advanced civilization. And of course, the nice added touch here is that Voyager was there the whole time and integrated into this planet's culture and mythology. So it was just so fascinating seeing the Voyager crew in just a few days have to deal with centuries of a planet's evolution. We get some great moments, such as when the Doctor visits the planet for an hour, which ends up being 4 years, in which he experiences a life that's only hinted at, where apparently he has a son. And the first contact with the astronaut, played by Daniel Day Kim, who would go on to play Jen in the show Lost, was amazingly handled, as they became fast friends and he managed to starve off an attack by his people that they launched on Voyager, and instead got them to help Voyager leave orbit. In the final scene where he's an old man watching Voyager leave, which for them was just several hours later, was a great way to end this very thoughtful episode. Coming in at number 3 is Drone. This was a very touching episode where a transporter accident occurs that merges 7 of 9's nanotechnology with the Doctor's mobile emitter, resulting in a birth of a 29th century style Borg. While the science involved here is a bit spotty at best, it ends up resulting in an excellent character story that breaks all conventions and avoids overused cliches at every turn. I was so impressed that this episode was wise enough to avoid the whole storyline of the drone turning evil and turning on Voyager despite their best efforts to raise him properly, which would be just another overused cliche intended to shock, but instead it went in a much more brave and much more powerful direction by telling a very personal story of 7-9 essentially becoming a mother as she teaches this advanced drone about what it means to be an individual and the importance of being free. And the way they played with one's inner power struggle as he had to choose between the Borg and Voyager was done extremely well and played to the tension of this episode. But the ending where one sacrifices himself in order to save Voyager from the Borg was just so heartbreaking. The scene where Seven asks him to stop what he's doing because he's hurting her, and his response is, "You will adapt," and then he dies. That brings tears to my eyes every time, because the journey in this episode was so well executed, as you can really relate to Seven, as it begins with her learning to live with her emotion and what it means to be human, and then later on having a son. Basically having a son who died had a huge impact on her. Not only that, but through her having to convince him the importance of individuality, it made her realize this is important as well. So making this one of the best episodes of Star Trek Voyager. Now let's get to my number 2 favorite Voyager episode, and that is Deadlock. This was an intense tour de force that had me on the edge of my seat the whole time, but more than that, told a fascinating science fiction story of Voyager literally splitting into 2 duplicates where 2 Voyager crews must work together. But the beginning of this episode was absolutely groundbreaking, as it told the very dark story of a pregnant woman losing her baby as the ship is torn apart around them, and Ensign Harry Kim dies. But then we learned there's a duplicate Voyager that was unaffected by all this, and to see them interact with this damaged Voyager and try to deal with the fact that both of their ships are in danger, and the most likely solution is for one of the ships to sacrifice themselves so the other can live, and that was truly intense. But on top of all that, the Voyager that was undamaged comes under attack by the Vidians, and we get another apocalyptic scene where the Vidians come on board and begin killing off the entire crew, including some fan favorites, and to see the solution of Harry Kim taking the baby to the other Voyager while Janeway destroys her ship to also destroy the Vidians, so that the damaged Voyager could survive, was just amazingly done. I mean, the whole moment of when the Vidians make it to the bridge and Janeway simply says, "Welcome to the bridge," right before the ship self-destructs and blows them up, was so badass. The whole episode was simply amazing in using these weird sci-fi concepts to ultimate storytelling effect. And my number one favorite episode of Star Trek Voyager is Year of Hell. This two-parter was simply epic as it shows the hell Voyager goes through when they enter a hostile alien's territory and are under constant attack, where the ship slowly starts to come apart around them and the crew must band together to survive, which leads to some amazing character stories as the characters struggle to remember what's important while facing impossible odds. And this all comes to a head when Janeway is forced to order the crew to abandon ship, leaving only a mere skeleton crew on board. And on top of that, we get this story of a ship going around erasing entire species from existence in a vain attempt to restore their empire to a state that it used to be before they started tampering with the timeline. And this story involved an amazing performance from guest star Kurtwood Smith as Anorix, whom we learn more about once he kidnaps Chakotay in Paris and ends up working with Chakotay to restore the timeline until Paris convinces Chakotay that this guy is crazy. And on Voyager, the skeleton crew managed to cuddle together in alliance with other races to take on Anorix, which results in an epic final showdown, leading to one of the best one-liners of the show when Janeway says, "Time's up," just before crashing Voyager into the time ship, thus restoring the timeline. Everything about these episodes are just top-notch. The character interactions, the acting, the dialogue, the music was just superb. That scene where Janeway says goodbye to the Tuvok, who's now blind at this point, and he realizes that she's just going to sacrifice herself. It was such a touching and epic scene, as this whole two-parter was just truly epic. One of the best stories ever told in the Star Trek universe, making this my number one favorite episode of Star Trek Voyager. So that's it for my top 10 favorite episodes of Star Trek Voyager, which also wraps up my revamps of my Star Trek episode top 10 videos, as I also recently remade videos for my original series and Deep Space Nine episode top 10s, and I will not be doing one for my Next Generation Enterprise top 10s, as I'm happy with the versions that I currently have for those two, and you can check out all these videos on my channel. Also, be sure to keep an eye on my channel as I continue to do Star Trek videos, as well as covering many other shows such as Game of Thrones, Black Sails, The Expanse, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.